So far away, Lucas and lovely audience at home, are you ready for another spooky episode of Wiki Weekends?
We're getting towards the end of spooky season now, Karl.
We are indeed, but today we're going to talk about one of my, weirdly one of my favourite games, because I forgot about how much I liked it until I went and read the wiki for it. I'm like, hang on, yeah, I had a lot of fun playing this. And that game is The Suffering. But before we get into talking about The Suffering, Lucas, let's talk about a scary movie. And that scary movie being I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, which is a movie that is sponsoring this video. That's right, we're being sponsored by Movie Productions. That's how professional we've gotten now. Isn't that great?
Hell yeah. I mean, as I'm sitting here with I can just see in my own camera a little wiglet sat on top of Stitch's head. And it's yeah, we're professional.
If you want to keep us deep in wiglets, this sponsor money is going to do it for us. So the guys over at I'll Be Glad When You're Dead are running an Indiegogo that launches on Halloween. And I've been in contact with a liaison from the people making this movie for about 6 months now. And I want to note that the guy I've been in contact with is called Brendan Butt. So it's just, there's a guy called, he's called B Butt and Mr. Smallwood just talking to each other for the past 6 months while been working out this deal on the back end. And it is a horror slasher movie set in Canada, so Canadian horror, the most scary of the horrors, set in an actual World War II Cold War era bunker, because they sent on a little fact sheet of hello Karl, here's a fact sheet about our movie, and it's it's filmed in this cool bunker that was meant to be full of gold. We're one of 4 movies that's filmed there. Also, half our crew used to make Christmas movies, so you know they can't wait to film a movie where a bunch of people get their shit wrecked. And speaking of getting their shit wrecked, let's talk about The Suffering. So did you play The Suffering? Are you aware of The Suffering? Or its sequel, Suffering Ties That Bind?
I literally was not aware of this game until you mentioned it on a previous episode a week ago.
Okay, so I'm a huge fan of horror. I'm a huge fan of psychological horror. I'm a huge fan of practical creature effects. And The Suffering is a blending of all 3 of these concepts. Admittedly, it's a video game, so it's not practical creature effects, but it's very interesting creature design. So the basic premise, we can go over it now, because we have the Wikipedia page in front of me. Links to that can be found below, alongside ones for our sponsor. The Suffering is a first and third person shooter horror video game developed by Surreal Studios for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Microsoft Windows. The game was published by Midway Games for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox and the PC version, blah, 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 blah. It says here that there was going to be a GameCube version, but it was cancelled because, the GameCube wasn't hood enough to, run some Suffering. Because, this game, it's weird. It comes from the era of Edge. You know that era, right? Edge. But I feel it kind of had more to it.
Something dark and unspeakable left you deeply scarred.
There was a bit more substance to the game than just pure Edge. So, The Suffering centers around the story of Talk. There's the Edge. There's the Edge coming in. A prisoner on death row who is accused of murdering his ex-wife and 2 children, a crime that he has no memory of committing. Shortly after he arrives on Abbott State Penitentiary on Carney Island, again, The Edge.
Sometimes even the strongest will is not enough to hold back the demons inside.
Earthquake hits the island, resulting in the prison being attacked by supernatural threats from the island's past. After being freed, Talk attempts to fight his way to freedom while confronting his own personal demons, while trying to remember what actually happened. And the game features 3 endings, which depends on the player's gameplay choices throughout, each of which reveals different versions of the murder of Talk's family. So it has a loose morality system. And that morality system is informed by your gameplay, and there's a lot of rumors and industry legend about the intricacies of the morality system. Lucas, as someone who play a lot of video games, you probably know what the morality system boils down to, right?
I mean, it's one or two things. It's either have you been good, evil, or neutral throughout the game, or it's do you want to pick one of 3 endings at the very end before the last cutscene happens.
You want to be the president who cured cancer or the president who solved world hunger?
And it's that there's you get presented with a lot of choices throughout the game, but it is still very interesting the way it's handled. There's a lot of it's not too subtle, look out for it, but I still think it's worth noting that it had it. For example, the character Talk throughout the game, the more evil choices you make, the dirtier he becomes. Like, he just becomes a lot more grimy and grungy. And you have, like, a picture of your family you can go look at, and, like, the more evil choices you make, the more, like, you know, just disheveled and dirty that picture looks. And it's like, again, not subtle, but I appreciate they went to the effort of putting that in.
I really appreciate when, games do it where that you actually have some kind of visual aspect to it, because, you know, say for example, like I remember at least one of the Fable games did it where you become like angelic or demonic.
Yeah, which was
looking
so on the nose.
It is, but I think I quite like the fact that, like, it's a cartoonish world, like, you know, very over the top. I like the fact that you can, like, become this cool demonic evil character by being evil, but then you have like Mass Effect 2 where you get like the facial scarring and it looks really nasty, and it's meant to be like the payment
visual corruption,
for being evil, but then it's like, oh, do you want to spend credits to have facial surgery and get rid of it?
Yeah. And one thing I actually really appreciate about the suffering as well is the character of Torque is black. I think specifically about Torque I think there may be mixed race. But he's certainly, like, you know, he's of like a darker complexion.
Beat his ex-wife to a bloody pulp. Killed her with his fists.
Look, I said I didn't...
Then he drowned one son in the tub and threw the other out a window. Don't ask me to cry for him.
Just a black protagonist in a video game. A black original protagonist in a horror video game?
You telling me that all video games don't have to start boring white men?
Yeah, no, you get the name's Torque, and then you've got, like, the kind of the problematic element of, okay, he's in prison for murdering his family, but then still, you know, there's more depth to the character of Torque throughout. One of the things that I really like about the morality system is that, in addition to affecting, like, visuals, like, you know, the way that, you know, the ending, the way your character looks, it also affects the way people talk to you, which I think was a really neat thing for the time. So, just for the curious, this game was released in 2004. So to have, like, you know, different dialogue based on the choices that you've made, that was, like, pretty, like, you know, like, new for the time.
I mean, voice acting in general was pretty new for the time.
And we have here gameplay, and, like, you know, I'm not going to talk about the actual, like, the gameplay, like, itself, but, like, you know, this includes, like, the development and, like, the enemies. So it's a third-person action game where you control Torque from a first or third-person perspective, depending on your preference. And playing it in first person is, like, a way different experience. Like, I remember playing through it in third person, and then playing it in first person, and it's so much scarier. Because when you're in first person, you can't do that thing you can do in third person of looking around corners with the camera.
That's what I was going to mention, is, like, I'm really surprised that this game is a third and first person shooter.
Admittedly, it doesn't control well in either, but still, the fact you can switch between both.
Neither do Bethesda games, and they're still doing it in 2023.
But you can switch between both at will, and it is an entire, like, playing in third person, it's more like character action. Playing in first person, it is genuinely scary.
Yeah, because as you say, like, you don't get that thing of being able to see things approaching from behind, seeing around corners, etc., etc., and it just very much shows why most horror games go for, like, the first person perspective.
Yep, and
just a bit easier to, like, get you scared that way.
And here's something interesting. Most of the enemies in the game are representative of different execution methods that have taken place on Carnate Island, and that's where you get... So even if you've not played the game, Lucas, you might be familiar with the imagery of, like, the lethal injection enemy, where it has, like, needles for eyes.
I'm not, but, you know, while you continue talking, I'm going to Google, like, the suffering
Google
enemies.
the monsters. Have a look at some of the monsters in it, but I'll say, like, Slayers represent decapitation, Marksmen represent death by firing squad, Mainliners, lethal injection, Noosemen, hanging, and the Burrowers represent being buried alive. Other creatures represent events from Carnate's history, because it's an island where a lot of bad stuff has happened. For example, Festers are the reincarnation of slave traders who ran their slave ship aground on Carnate and left their slaves tied up in the hold to be eaten by rats rather than freeing them. And that's something that, again, you're playing as a black protagonist, and you encounter enemies that represent slave traders.
Rats live within their flesh, writhing within it and then springing forth randomly. They appear to be a reincarnation, not of the slaves, for then they would be of darker skin tone, but instead of the slave traders. In this form, they are forced to live out again and again the fate they forced upon those hapless slaves.
Right, yeah.
And that's it. Again, it's like, and like I said, edge. There's a lot of edge. Admittedly, yes. But that's like a pretty daring topic to try and address in this action horror game. And I can't think of many video games that have addressed a topic as dark as that.
No, and some of these enemies are like...
They look super cool, right?
They do, but they're tackling some, very, very dark subjects of, like, the Nooseman just following you. Like, that's... The imagery of that is very unsettling.
Well, speaking of it, the Infernos are trapped spirits of 3 children who accused 11 innocent people of being witches during a time of Puritan settlement on the island. The 11 people burned alive.
And then you've just got one called Torque's Hatred. What is Torque's Hatred?
That is like which I'll get to because that's a cool thing. It's like, don't spoil yourself. So, as Torque kills enemies during the game, an on-screen meter will be filled called the Insanity Meter. Once it is full, it begins to flash, and at this point, Torque can transform into a monster. In this form, he can tear enemies apart and can perform several powerful attacks. The more enemies he kills whilst in this form, the more powerful the monster becomes, and the more combo moves become available. However, when in this form, his health depletes, and if he doesn't change back to his human form prior to his health fully depleting, he will die. And one of the things that I love about this is like a lot of the stories told as is horror game staples, audio logs, and text. And one of the audio logs you can get in either this game or the second one, because in my head they both occupy the same thing because I played them back to back, is they talk about this monster form, and they say that Torque has like a coping mechanism where he sees this monster that he becomes, and that's like one of the ways he copes with all the violent acts he's committed. That's not real. He's just going into a fugue state, and his body is flooded with more adrenaline than I've ever seen a human being deal with. And he's literally tearing people apart with his bare hands. And he comes up with the idea of the monster to help cope with it.
Ever wonder why you're so furious, Torque? What happens then when your world goes black? Do you ever see a creature, a beastly form, the likes of which would cause any sane man to flee in terror? Tell me about him. How does he make you feel? So
it's like that, and that's something thing. And when you think about it, that was probably pretty obvious. Like, he's not actually transforming into a monster. He's having a psychotic break, and he's just like
hence why it's filled by an insanity meter.
But I remember being like, oh my god, he's not turning into a monster. That's just how he visualizes himself in that. And the monster as well, based on immorality, will become more demonic or more like Torque.
In my dream, I witnessed the inmate Torque transform into this beast and lay waste to all around him. Since the cataclysm, I have seen Torque go berserk, killing beasts with his bare hands. But of course, during such times, he himself does not actually transform into a beast. He merely becomes intensely enraged.
Like when you're doing like a morally good playthrough, the monsters look like a buff version of Torque, where it's like the evil playthrough, it does like this like hellish monster with like knives and shit.
Seems to be quite literally connected to an inmate, the convicted killer Torque. Incredible as it may sound, this creature appears to have a miniature version of Torque attached to him via a long umbilicus. Beyond that, I can only say that I view him as the most evil of all the creatures, a pure manifestation of fury and hatred.
I did get quite excited when you talked about the insanity meter, because there's a game you might be familiar with, Eternal Darkness on the GameCube.
Yes, really fun game.
Where I've not played it myself, but it's very famous for having like an insanity meter throughout the game, and like your character basically just starts like seeing things that they otherwise wouldn't if you don't play the game. Like, for example, the games will like, it doesn't work very well now because displays on TVs are different, but like it'll like change the channel or make you think like that your game save has been erased and things like this. And I wish more games would experiment with the idea of like going insane and fucking around with your game because of it.
Yeah, so speaking of which, a major part of the gameplay in the suffering concerns Torque's morality. At numerous points in the game, the player will encounter situations where they have several choices as how to proceed. These situations involve NPCs, and the choices are usually to help a person, good morality, kill them, bad morality, or ignore them, neutral morality. So it's like, it's basic, but, I still appreciate the fact that it's there.
I mean, it's 2004. That's not bad for that kind of era of video games.
And it says that in many situations when Talk encounters an NPC, the player will hear the voice of his wife, urging him to help them, and almost immediately afterwards hear the voice of a demon, urging him to kill. How Talk's actions affect his morality is usually indicated by the reaction of his wife, who will praise him if he commits good acts, and chastise him if he does something evil. And one of the things that I like is when you save people, it actually, killing them, usually it's quicker. Saving them, though, they'll join you.
Right.
And they will fight alongside you, and they can permanently die.
It's one thing that I don't necessarily like on replaythroughs, but I enjoy in Bioshock, for example, where you get the choice of, you don't get to just be neutral.
Bioshock is, my favourite one of, I remember I played Bioshock after all the hype had died down. It's hearing about these really intricate moral choices. Do you want to harvest the child brain with a giant needle or not? It's that's not a moral choice.
But it's presented as being more rewarding for the player to kill them and harvest the Adam from them. But then it kind of it's really interesting in first playthrough, but when you realise the breakdown of it, but if you save every single one of them and never give in to temptation, they'll reward you with an even bigger buff at the end. And it's so you're actually, there's no question in this. There's not be evil for more reward or be good. It's be good for the most reward, and that's how it breaks down. It's
morality systems, that's one of these I don't like them in many games. They're not handled well. We recently played for Mass Effect together, didn't we? And it's basically if you don't min-max into either fully Paragon, fully Renegade, you miss out on critical choices that result in characters dying. So the lesson there isn't that you can succeed by just you don't play the game and role play it making the decisions that you would. You just go through and just pick the blue or red options every single time to get the maximum possible buff for it.
Well, yeah, because we were playing through it over on our Twitch and letting chat help control the Paragon or Renegade options, and it inevitably, because we were trying to be choose different moral decisions based on the situation at hand, like a normal person would, we ended up in a situation where one of our party members died when they didn't need to. We couldn't stop the humans taking over the council because, again, we didn't min-max into one or the other.
Yep. And we have here the suffering actually handles this in a fairly interesting way. So for example, it says here that not every choice presents the player with all three possibilities. For example, when Talk finds the controls to an electric chair, he can turn on the chair to torture an inmate strapped into it. Bad morality, or simply ignore the controls. Neutral. There is no good choice available to the player here, because ultimately that is a criminal. Likewise, there's another choice where a man is had his limbs removed and is slowly dying. You can kill the man to put him out of his misery, the good choice, or ignore him for the neutral choice. However, there is no bad morality choice here. And that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, the person's going to die regardless, so you can't be evil in that scenario.
And I just doing that alone is why the people making it probably thought about it more than not at all. It says here that over the course of the game, the decisions culminate in one of three endings, and the player can get a rough idea of Talk's morality level by both Talk's own physical appearance. Good acts make him appear healthier, evil acts make him appear less human, and that goes into a psychological aspect. Is that actually happening, or is that just how Talk sees himself? The more he gives into these base evil desires, he just sees himself as being less human to cope. And that's just interesting that gets a question that's raised by the game. And then we have the plot. The plot is super long, obviously but let's just go through the basics. He's a silent protagonist, he arrives on the island.
How do they handle in terms of moral decisions and stuff with it being a silent protagonist?
You just make the choice. It's other people responding to them.
Right, okay. So that's interesting to have a game based on moral decisions where you've got the silent protagonist and even in cutscenes and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna say obviously you have your final boss. So let's just go with the three endings. I kind of like the fact basically just deciding how you want to play, Torque becomes a very different character. So we have here. So, depending on the player's actions throughout the game, you can have one of 3 endings. So, spoilers for like, a 20-year-old game almost here. The good ending, Torque remembers that his wife and children were killed while he was spared by 2 criminals under the orders of a third individual called the Colonel, who also incriminated Torque in order to make him suffer, hence the name. Torque heads to the docks and is picked up by the Coast Guard. On the boat, the captain recognises him and reveals that his case has been reopened after the prosecutor was indicted, and Torque will likely have a retrial. The game ends with the boat sailing away from the island. Because obviously you escape from the island at the end of it, and you just remembers. Bad ending, Torque remembers that he was the one who killed his family when the Coast Guard arrives. He transforms into his monster state and kills them all before running back into the woods.
It's interesting then that implies, like, based on how you play, is actually informing whether he did do the crime or not.
Yeah, and that's part of the story is like, did I actually do it? And then the neutral ending, which I think is the most interesting one, Torque remembers that he accidentally killed his wife during a heated discussion, and out of revenge, his eldest son drowned his younger brother before killing himself. And I like that as an ending, that it was an accident. It was an accident, but he's still got to live with the consequences. In this ending, when the Coast Guard arrives, Torque knocks him out and commandeers the boat, sailing away from Carnate Island.
And, like, obviously you said there's a Suffering 2.
Yeah.
Is a canon ending?
We'd have to double check that one. No, we'd have to double check. You know what? We can cover that in another episode.
Okay.
But I thought the game's mechanics here, because I just thought it's really interesting the way they did it. So an important element of the design process, what Rouse refers to as player empowerment, allowing players a great deal of freedom while interacting with the game's world. The key concept was that the player's actions should work to determine the guilt or innocence of Torque, with the Rouse stating, and I quote, "Players will be allowed to make important choices about how they act in the game world, thus tying into our morality system. Through these important choices, the player is able to determine the main character Torque's guilt or innocence of the crime that landed him in prison in the first place. We felt that this was our strongest element of player empowerment, allowing players to determine not only Torque's future, but also his past. Something altogether unique in gaming to this point." Which is, isn't it? Depending on the moral choices, you actually influence the past of the character.
Yeah, that's not something I've seen explored in many games. It's like a lot of, oh yeah, your morals affect the future, but not much in the past. That's a cool idea.
Yeah, and then just like one fun thing on the design, because I think the design is like real fun. So gameplay and design. An early decision on part of the development team was that the Suffering be more of an action game than a traditional survival horror. This had implications on much of the design work, as it meant we were going to focus more on combat and avoid the long cutscenes, frail central characters, clumsy controls, fixed camera angles, and sparse ammo of many console horror games of the era. Another early decision was to keep the central character as much of a mystery as possible, implying only his strength and little else. Artist Mike Nichols said, "We didn't really want a character that looked any particular nationality or race. He really is almost Neanderthal in appearance. He's very primal. We wanted that strength to come through." But ultimately, you see a picture of his wife and kids. And it's that thing, but like they do, it's ambiguously, but in the second game, Torque's black.
Be careful, my brother. You must think before you act.
And creature design was also incredibly important to the design team, with the team determined to create a unique array of enemies. To quote one person who worked on it, "From the beginning, we wanted to stay away from zombies and the more tired horror cliches that everyone had had enough of. We wanted to move on to something that was more disturbing and more unique to the experience, and took advantage of the setting of a prison. It was also early on we decided we wanted to have a theme for all the creatures. They weren't just these random monsters or random aberrations," he said, "each themed after a different execution method that ties into the history of Carnate and all the various forms of execution and suffering that humans have gone on there." Which, I think is really interesting. And they took a lot of influence from Stan Winston, which is very evident when you look at the designs.
It's very almost like Silent Hill-esque in the trying to make different enemies rather than just like, yeah, fuck it, it's zombies. Yeah,
and it says here that so they basically Stan Winstonized all their designs, but also wanted to not shy away from tackling or handling pretty rough topics. For example, to have a disturbing and unsettling tone, we knew that creepy monsters alone would not be enough. Therefore, we wanted to tie into real-world horrific events. Thus, the storyline is suffused with the darkest elements of American history, including prison life and culture, slavery, racism, unethical medical experimentation, mob mentality executions, and the death penalty. This is a fairly serious subject matter for a video game, particularly an action-adventure one, and it amplified the horror of our world tremendously. And you can argue one way or the other how effective it was at that, but the fact that they were willing to tackle a subject of that nature, and obviously had enough wherewithal about them to acknowledge the fact that this is a difficult subject matter. It's not usually the avenue for a video game to cover this, especially not an action video game. A lot of care was taken to make sure we weren't crass or flippant. Yeah, and that actually ties quite nicely into the sponsor for today's video, I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, which handles some similarly dark and difficult subject matter, the extent of which I won't spoil for anyone watching now, but suffice to say, it has there's some dark elements in there, and I have spoken both to our liaison, Mr. Brendan Button Smallwood, working together on a project, which is just funny to me, and one of the the lead creatives on it, and just the way they were willing to just engage with the subject matter, and in an academic sense, assured me, they're not just putting this in for shock value. They actually have a point they're trying to make through the medium of this film. But hopefully people did enjoy this video, because like I said, I really enjoyed The Suffering when I was younger, and it's probably a game I want to go back and replay, because I feel like now I'm a bit older, a bit wiser, and more educated on just the language of film, the topics that have been covered in it. I'd be interested to see if it holds up, if not from a gameplay perspective, from a story perspective, because I remember it playing as a teenager and being uncomfortable with some of the subjects and topics being discussed and handled. Now, I would be curious to go back and have a look at some of those. But you know what? Maybe one day we'll stream part of the game either on Twitch or on this channel as a bonus thing for somebody. But if you want to see us do that, the easiest way to do it is to support the channel. You can you can comment, subscribe, or you can support the supporter of today's video who sponsored us. I'll be glad when you're dead. And thanks to those guys out there, and just big appreciation for the fact that they're sponsoring us for $666 to really commit to the Halloween gimmick.
Yeah, and that's over a few sponsor spots and stuff that you will obviously be seeing over the next week or so. And just also want to shout out the fact that they're leaning into just the silly aspect and going with the potential of having a VHS version. So
yes, if you do want to be a big dick legend and help out today's sponsor, go check out that Indiegogo link below. One of the the rewards you can get, depending on the level of support you offer them, is a VHS copy of the film. Do you remember special editions of video games where they just come with dumb knickknacks that you put on your shelf and you look at every now and then and go, I remember playing The Suffering?
Well, it's funny because there's been a lot of, limited run games, for example. They do a lot of special editions, or just special editions in general, where you can get the vinyl or the CD as an extra added bonus. Where's the VHS bonus?
Yeah, and it's it's a nice bit of physical meat you can hold in your hand. I also like the idea of them doing because it's set, obviously typical classic horror trope of it's these bunch of kids and shit's about to get super real. The art book they're doing is in the style of a yearbook, which is super cool, which I've never had because we're not American, but that'd be kind of cool to own and have on a shelf. I'm is that your yearbook? It's no, it's a yearbook for a horror movie. It's that's awesome. Let's have a look.
Yeah, I just think the different levels of tiers sound really fun, and I love the fact that when just written on the notes to us, it's just we did a VHS copy for the memes and the lols.
Yeah, I love as well, because it's one of those things that just it lets you know you're working with someone who just I can pull back the curtain on this. I've been speaking to Brendan from their liaison to us for a couple of months now, and they've just been such cool guys behind the scenes. When they had to push production back, they sponsored a few fact theme videos. I was do you want your sponsor money back? No, we paid for the sponsorship. That's your money. Just we'll contact you at a later point when we were able to relaunch. And I really appreciated that. Or the fact that when I said, oh yeah, I'll speak about it with Lucas, can you send him a fact sheet? And they wrote you a little fact sheet with all their branding and stuff on there. It was hi, because I think it even says that's what you look. It says, hi Lucas.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and I much respect that, and just the idea that it's just Oh, hey, so, this is just a bunch of people that all year round have to make Christmas films, and now we finally get to pop off and make Halloween
That's
one.
one of my favourite details, is that 'cause I looked this up in like the fact theme video that I edited for them, and I looked at like the executive producer or something, like worked on like the most Hallmark of Hallmark movies. I'm like, if I had to work on this shit in like March, and this was my life
All
like
year
3
round, yeah.
months, I would want to make a movie where the main character gets like fucking murked by a fire axe to the back of the head.
The law may be her calling,
You're gonna make a great lawyer.
but it's ice sculpting that truly melts her heart.
When you find something that you really love, to hang on to it.
I would be like, I would just be like, I would be sat there going, I wish everyone, like, everyone on screen right now just died. I wish a guy would run in with a fire axe and just put me out of my fucking misery. You know what? That's an idea. If they want a free horror movie idea, like, use your chops as, like, for making these Hallmark Christmas movies. And
It starts out that way, and
Yeah.
then a horror villain gets
just
introduced.
make it into a horror movie halfway through without any warning. I'd watch that. I would watch a horror movie where it's set out like the most generic of generic Hallmark Christmas movies. This is a high-powered female lawyer who like lives in New York, and but she goes back to her hometown and gets dicked down by Big Dick Don, who teaches her those small town ways are best. But then halfway through, just a guy runs in with a fucking chainsaw. I'd watch that movie. That's a free idea. You can have that one. Just give me an executive producer's credit. But thank you to everyone who's watching at home. Thank you to our sponsors. And as always, have the day you all deserve. And cheers.